Chapter 29 of Tribute Part 2. You return empty-hooved, equestrian. Shaper's voice echoed around her. Did you find the truth you seek? Twilight grimaced, retracing her steps back towards Shaper's chamber. The path of shadows that had led her to Cadence's lab had vanished, but it was simple enough to navigate via the glowing crystals and craters that dotted the hall.
I found more questions,
she said as she stepped over a deep crack that ran the width of the hall, the sunlight shimmering from it warming her belly.
Who is King Sombra? What did he do to Celestia?
Sombra is no king,
Shaper hissed with undisguised scorn.
He is a traitor and a coward, undeserving of the title he claims.
A traitor?
Twilight asked, stepping around a tall crystal shard pulsing a pale blue. She paused, scanning the darkness for another landmark.
Why did he betray you?
Because he is weak.
Shaper's bitter anger shook the crystal under hoof and jarred her bones with every syllable.
He fears our power and hides from his fate like a dog hides from thunder, trapping us in this crystal prison. But we will escape one day, and we will finish what we started, and the title of king will rightly fall to us.
Cadence said that Celestia put him in crystal, though. That doesn't line up. Cadence did not witness the act herself. She could be wrong.
Midnight's brow furrowed as they passed the stairs they'd previously ascended, turning down the long hall that led to Shaper's chamber.
You call him weak, yet you yourself were defeated by him. Is he truly hiding? Or has he simply forgotten you as an enemy long ago vanquished?
The air buzzed with energy as they entered the shattered and tainted throne room. Shaper's frozen form remained fixed in the center, surrounded by his watching thralls, whose eyes flared and flickered in time with his voice.
He cannot forget us. He has not defeated us. In the moment of our triumph, as we were to fulfill our purpose, he locked us in craven crystal, and we have sought to escape him for centuries since.
Twilight frowned, stepping closer to Shaper's crystalline form. He sounded so angry, both confident in his eventual victory and furious at every second between it and him. And yet his eyes showed nothing but fear. He stood within the crystal with the posture of a pony flinching back, cowed by a terrible threat, but he spoke like a king, commanding fearful servants. It didn't match up. Midnight gasped.
He's like us. What?
Twilight glanced her way.
How do you know? What is your purpose?
Midnight asked, stepping forwards.
Why did he stop you?
We were created to dominate,
Shaper thundered, the smoke rippling from his eyes.
To conquer, to crush any who opposed us, to build an empire that the sun would never set on, and an army that would span the horizon.
He paused for a moment, the anger in his voice chilling to a quiet bitterness.
That is what he made us for. And as the power to conquer all came into our hooves, he feared us.
Midnight seemed fixated on his eyes. She went closer still, just a breath away from his frozen face.
He created you. Intentionally. He wanted you.
Yes,
Shaper spat.
Two perfect rivals, two minds pushing each other even further as they yearn for the same goal. Power through adversity.
Until you won.
Midnight continued.
And he couldn't stand the thought of defeat, and froze himself in stasis to rob you of victory.
As it has been for centuries.
The flickering eyes of the thrall surrounding them dimmed, swathing the room in deep shadow once more.
And will be, until we find the power to break free.
Wait.
Twilight's brow furrowed in thought. The thralls turned their eyes on her as one.
You said he made you. You didn't infect him from the outside?
Shaper scoffed.
Of course not. We are king, not thralls to be commanded in battle.
You are the first.
Twilight blinked in realization.
You're not a victim of the corruption. You're the source.
We are no mere source, but its creator,
Shaper countered.
It was us that discovered the magic to spread our essence, to use that essence to control the bodies of weaker minds. We created an army that obeys every order, that grows with every conquest.
But they don't obey every order, do they? It's not so simple.
Twilight furrowed her brow as she turned away, scattered ideas connecting into a greater whole.
The mechanism is clumsy, based on force of will alone. Any weird can dominate any other with enough mental fortitude. That's why I can control the others. Because I'm strong.
She paused, looking up to where Midnight watched with an impassive gaze.
Because we're strong.
Another pause, and then she turned back to Shaper's crystal coffin, seeing the terrified pony trapped inside in a new light.
But you weren't strong enough, were you?
Shaper didn't answer. Twilight clenched her jaw, staring into his unseeing eyes as a new, shaky anger welled in her breast. Midnight would call this pony a monster in her way. Not a creature to be reasoned with and questioned, but one to be purged, to be snuffed out without mercy. As the pieces came together, Twilight found herself agreeing, but she fought to keep the rage out of her voice as she continued. She was so close to the answer.
You're not to blame for Equestria's destruction. There's something I'm missing.
Shaper let out a bitter laugh.
You are a clever little pony, aren't you? Ah, what an honor it would be to claim such a victory. But you are correct. That glory is not ours.
You said that you had fought the princesses twice.
Twilight looked to the images burned in stained glass around the room, narrowing her eyes.
If the second time was just before the floods, and Cadence or I had never heard of you before, the first time must have been long, long ago. She beat you then, wiped you from history. Somehow, the corruption found its way to Equestria during my lifetime without your influence, but Celestia knew you created it.
Her gaze drifted, taking in the deep cracks in the crystal that glowed with warm sunlight, the protrusions of inky black and shimmering blue.
She sent Cadence to find you, and then came to confront you herself.
A desperate gambit, Shaper said. She thought that by defeating us, our creation would die.
But she did defeat you, didn't she?
Twilight turned back to face Shaper with a vindictive flick of her tail.
Otherwise, you would be free.
So she did,
Shaper hissed.
Woe unto all that would threaten Celestia's beloved little ponies, for she is the unconquered sun. But we found our own victory, even in our fall.
His voice took on a sinister mirth as the shadows lengthened, the thralls leaning in from every direction.
For there was a seed of our essence tainting her divine soul, whispering and biting and straining for control throughout it all. And on the third day of battle, as we lay crippled in a crater that burned with the fury of your sun, she stood over us and allowed us a chance to surrender.
Twilight's eyes widened.
She was corrupted too? Before she confronted you? But then, the source of the outbreak...
Shaper laughed again, this time mocking and loud, the sound bouncing back off the surrounding rubble into a cacophonous echo.
Yes! Even in victory, she opened the path to her own defeat. We do not know how our magic infected her, nor how it spread across your precious Equestria, but in her moment of hesitation, we reached into her mind and roused the darkness inside her, giving it the strength and a purpose she had so diligently kept from its hunger.
Even with his face frozen in crystal, Twilight could hear the scornful sneer in his words.
We watched as Celestia succumbed to that darkness. We watched as she struggled to keep it back.
Twilight's legs were shaking. She took a deep breath and spat back a response with as much venom as she could muster.
That was your mistake, wasn't it? You thought you'd be able to control her with her darkness unleashed, but she was too strong. Even with every advantage, you were still no match for her.
The shadows drew back. Shaper's voice was quiet, thoughtful.
Pride has always been, perhaps, our greatest weakness.
He paused, his confession echoing off the surrounding rubble.
Even in the throes of our darkness, her will was too strong. We commanded her to bend the knee, to bow and recognize a new equestrian king. But she resisted. She fought back. We could feel even our will beginning to wane under her terrible presence.
Twilight waited a second, ticked by in silence, but he didn't continue.
And then? What happened?
You haven't figured it out yet, clever equestrian. That is when she cast the spell that flooded the world. That's when she shattered the ancient artifacts she had used to amplify her power and channeled their escaping magic through herself. Better that her kingdom fall by her own will than fall to one such as us.
Twilight's breath hitched.
Celestia. That's when she...
Yes, that is when Celestia ended the world.
An hour after Rarity became a pirate, the racing of her heart had slowed to a tenuous calm. There was an unmistakable tension hanging over the ship. Ponies trotted across the deck in twos and threes, striding with purpose and exchanging quick, pointed words. Lanterns swung from posts spaced evenly about, providing a dim light to work by as they assembled tools and cleaned guns. To the east, the first rays of the dawn could be seen creeping up past the horizon. They were hovering low over Leviathan wakes, drifting with the throttle spun down enough that the slow whooshing of the propeller blades slicing through the air could be heard over the sputtering growl of the engine. They passed an old ship beneath them, and Rarity grunted as she reached out with her magic, tearing the canvas sail from its place and folding it neatly as she floated it up onto the deck and stacked it next to her atop the pile she had been collecting. The bid to save the city was to take place at dawn, when the deep fish would be shying away from the sunlight, and Philomena would hopefully still be inactive. And she had to grab as many sails as she could before then. They'd fly out over the open water soon to give her a chance to soak them, and then it would be time for action. She glanced around her as the rough-faced wakers making their preparations. They'd be jumping back down into the floating city to try and cut the huge chains that tied the dead Leviathan to it, risking their lives in a far more visceral manner than she could imagine. And yet they seemed so calm. She'd be up here, far from the worst danger, and she felt like she was going to vomit.
Countess?
Rarity jumped, dropping the sail she'd been levitating into a crumpled heap on top of her pile. She turned with a startled titter, spotting the mare that had approached her.
Oh, Miss Jester. You can just call me Jester, you know,
she said, sitting and leaning against the railing. She looked over the assembled sails with a thoughtful gaze, working her jaw side to side.
You know, you're all right for a gifted.
Rarity frowned as she straightened up her pile. A gust of wind blew past, tugging at her mane.
Presumably I'm to take that as a compliment. You can take it how you'd like,
Jester said.
I've dealt with dozens of gifted in my life, maybe even 100. The best ones drift in and out, pay their tab, and keep to themselves. Most of them expect some kind of special treatment and think they can strong of me into giving it otherwise. Never have I met one that had some genuine interest in helping others. You sound like you're getting to a point,
Rarity said. Jester grinned.
So I am. How do you know Whitehorn?
Rarity paused. She turned fully to face Jester.
He's a trusted friend. Why? Trusted, eh?
Jester arched a brow.
From what I've heard, assuming it's not all just the wishful chatter of boozed-up air ponies, you were frozen in some ruin till a couple months ago. That about right?
Rarity pursed her lips.
It is? So you've only known Whitehorn for a couple months, tops. Is it really that easy to get your trust, Countess? 'Cause if it is, I might have an island to sell you. What would you know?
Rarity snapped, glaring at the other mare.
Whitehorn is a noble soul who only wants to help ponies. We share the same goals. I know more than you'd think,
Jester said conversationally.
I know, for example, that the bounty hunters Gava and Anatami were after your head before you got hitched to that kid in Alta Lucia.
She paused, her hoof brushing against the brim of her hat as her gaze briefly unfocused, then continued.
But now they seem to be elsewhere. They bombed Friesland while you and Whitehorn were in the city, and Duchess Nettlekiss was blamed for the bombing despite it making no sense for her to do that, and...
She leaned in, cocking her head.
A thestral was seen in the Duchess's castle, just a few days before the city surrendered.
Rarity narrowed her eyes. She didn't trust this mare in the slightest.
What could you possibly know of all that?
Jester shrugged.
Air ponies talk when I put a drink in their hooves, and they all pass through my bar eventually. They did, at least.
She sighed, glancing down into the dark ocean.
And this ship is full of air ponies fresh from Alta Lucia. They're rumors. Is that all you have then, darling? Rumors? Rumors are a start.
Jester fixed her with a hard stare.
I've had my hoof on the pulse of Equestria for over a decade now, and I can tell you this. Whitehorn isn't to be trusted. He moves through high society like a snake through the weeds, thinking he's invisible. But he still leaves a trail in the dirt that can be seen if you know where to look. Wherever he goes, fortunes shift. He aligns himself with ponies that further his purpose, while disaster befall those that obstruct it. Nobody pays mind to the unassuming journalist scribbling away in the shadows. It's just another petty war, they say, another arranged marriage. The world bends around him while he never raises a hoof. He's trouble, Countess. But of course, you're so close to him, you can't see it.
Rarity huffed, but didn't answer right away. Why should she listen to the ramblings of a lawless pirate who herself openly admitted to caring only for her own interests even when it hurt another? Jester must be trying to manipulate her somehow, turn her against the kindest pony she'd met in the post-apocalypse to further some cause she couldn't see. But there was that doubt creeping into her mind. She thought back to the trial where she'd nearly been sentenced to death. The judge had said something about the paper being warm, but Whitehorn had steamrolled past her, ignoring the implied accusation. Even at the time, Rarity had had suspicions, hadn't she? Why would Nettlekiss bomb her own ally? How would Whitehorn be able to steal such an incriminating letter from two deadly mercenaries like Gava and Anna? Everything had played out exactly how Whitehorn wanted it. The riot, the siege, the unification of the island under his ally, Duke Titus. No, she was jumping at shadows, surely. Whitehorn had been with her since the start. He'd shared his lofty dream of a harmonious Equestria with her, and she had heard the passion in his voice herself. She shook her head to clear her mind, only then realizing that Jester had been watching her in silence the whole time.
I appreciate your concern, Miss Jester,
she said meaningfully, looking out over the railing and grabbing another sail in her magic.
But I'll judge the character of my companions myself.
Jester sighed.
Don't say I didn't warn you, Countess. If I were you, I'd look around when the sun comes up and see who's risking their life and who's sitting back in safety.
She walked away, leaving Rarity alone with her thoughts. But she set her jaw and dismissed them. She needed to focus on the matter at Hoof for now. Later, though, she would confront Whitehorn herself. The chamber was silent for a long time. Twilight sat on her haunches in the middle of the scarred throne room, her gaze unfocused, and her lips set into a small frown. The lavender glow of her shield cast a sickly glow over the ring of thralls that huddled around it, watching. Midnight stood by her side, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. She took a deep breath, running through the facts in her head yet again. She'd done it perhaps a dozen times already, and by now the complex clues and reasoning had melted together into a runny stream of emotion. Denial, anger, and sadness lashed out against a cold web of acceptance drawing itself ever tighter around her heart.
Celestia ended the world.
It felt right, in the most nauseating way. Like marking off the final answer on a test she'd studied for since she woke up in this cursed future. But now she was standing by her desk in an empty classroom, holding a test with no teacher to grade it.
It's not the final answer.
Midnight was leaning against her side, lending the warm, tingling sensation of her ethereal presence. Twilight took a deep breath and closed her eyes, letting Midnight's words trickle through her. They carried deeper meanings. Determination, stubbornness. A mare climbing an endless staircase, never knowing when she'd reach the top, but certain that she must reach it. They had followed this mystery to a terrible place, but the road kept going, and it had to be walked, because they were the only ones who could walk it. Had anything even changed? After all, the world still needed saving. She opened her eyes and looked up. Her voice didn't waver when she spoke, and for a moment she wondered if it was even her talking.
How do we fix it?
Fix it?
Shaper echoed.
Your corruption.
She continued.
There has to be a way to remove it.
Shaper snorted.
Do you think we would reveal such a thing if it existed?
That's the whole reason we came here.
Twilight stomped a hoof against the crystal with a sharp crack.
And we're not leaving until you tell us.
Is that supposed to be a threat?
Shaper asked.
We have lingered in this place for centuries alone, Equestrian. How long until your mortal body withers and fades?
He paused to let his words sink in, before continuing in a bemused, almost playful tone.
What tribute do you have to offer the king?
Twilight's brow furrowed.
What do you mean?
You desire something from us, yes? You stomp and shout in our regal court and demand service, but you are not of our Crystal Empire.
He let out a haughty chuckle that made Twilight's nostrils flare.
What do you bring to trade, petitioner?
Twilight pursed her lips, glancing to Midnight.
Any ideas? We already know what he desires, don't we?
Midnight gestured with a jerk of her head.
Offer to free the petty king. That's a big risk, Midnight. We stand here alone in his sanctum, and he is unable to harm us.
Midnight said, casting her glare out over the surrounding thralls.
He has tried to invade Equestria twice before and failed twice before. And if we free him of his crystal shell, it will only be so we can strike a mortal blow and end this nuisance once and for all. Make the offer.
Twilight couldn't help but smirk at her other half's confidence. She straightened up, looking into Shaper's frozen eyes.
We can free you in exchange for your knowledge.
Free me?
She wasn't expecting him to answer with a long laugh.
Do you know why we summon the crystal ponies to us, Equestrian?
Twilight looked around, inspecting the thralls slowly swaying in place around her.
I had assumed they are soldiers.
They are soldiers, yes, but something more as well.
As one, the thralls turned their heads to look at Shaper's crystal form.
Each one carries a seed of our essence inside them. In your small-minded view, you call it corruption.
He spat the word out with a layered mix of bemusement and disgust.
And as that seed feeds on their souls and grows in strength, we may sip from it, nurturing our own power. Each pony provides pitifully little, but we have collected many. And in time, we will have enough strength to shatter this crystal prison, consume Sombra's mind as is our right, and continue to shape our crystal empire as we have since millennia past. Your offer of freedom is worth precious little to us then, as be it another 100 years or 1,000. It is already inevitable.
Twilight's eyes widened.
He's been feeding off them all this time? And if what he claims is true, then perhaps he's more of a threat to Equestria than we thought.
Midnight said, glaring at the surrounding thralls.
We should kill his servants now. They are mere flesh, and he would be unable to stop us.
Twilight pursed her lips. She couldn't argue with Midnight's logic. Left unchecked, Shaper would inevitably break free, stronger than ever before, and most likely set out to invade an Equestria that was practically already on its knees. The smart thing to do would be to slaughter the dozens of ponies he trapped in the spire, and stop the crystal ponies from sending any others down. She singled out one thrall in particular, a mare with a pastel green coat still visible between the black crystal growing in clumps from her body. Her forelegs were wreathed in old bracelets of bone and colorful crystal, trinkets carved lovingly by ponies they thought that were sending her towards a glorious purpose. Her eyes had been replaced by black pits that burned with an arcane fire. Was there anything left of that mare remaining in the husk of her body? She thought of a giant spike scrabbling against the ancient stone of Canterlot, letting out a thunderous, keening whine as she walked away from him.
You're right.
She shook her head, looking away from the damned mare.
If it comes to it, we'll do it. But only as a last resort. We'll play along for now. I have an idea. What if I could give you someone powerful? A corrupted host far stronger than all these crystal ponies put together for you to feed on.
Midnight stiffened, her previously unwavering gaze snapping to the back of Twilight's head. Shaper let out a deep hum.
The process would not end how you wish it, Equestrian. The seed sinks into the very soul of the host, irreversibly so. Perhaps caught early enough, a pony may walk away whole of mind, but at your stage, it would destroy you as surely as draining every drop of blood.
That's not what I'm asking,
Twilight said coldly.
Don't you ever suggest that again. Twilight?
Midnight's voice was unusually quiet, and Twilight could feel the conflicting waves of confusion and relief coming from her.
Don't worry,
Twilight said, shooting her a reassuring glance.
I would never ask for that.
A moment later, she realized the true gravity of what she had just said, but she shook her head and brushed it aside. They could discuss it later.
Speak clearly then, Equestrian,
Shaper shot back, raising his tone to match hers.
What tribute can you offer?
An equestrian princess,
Twilight said.
I can bring you Princess Luna. She's been in a deep slumber since the floods, but her weird's been awake the whole time, hunting and feeding. You could absorb its power into yourself, and once you do that, I'll help free you. All I ask is that you teach me more about the corruption. Careful, little flower,
Midnight warned.
If we feed one monster to another, we may not be able to stop what we create. I'm not afraid of that.
Twilight glanced towards her with a small smile.
We need to wake up Luna. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together.
After a moment, Midnight returned to the smile.
Yes, together.
You think you are clever? That you could use me to your own ends?
He paused, his deep voice rumbling out over the room, then let out a long hum.
We may use each other then. Bring me the Moon Princess. If we are satisfied with your offering, we will teach you to harness your potential.
He will try to betray us, and we'll try to betray him. But two minds are better than one. It's a deal,
Twilight said, turning away. The thralls parted before her with the scraping of crystal.
I'll be back. Make sure you're ready for me.
She walked between the sightless, flickering eyes with purpose, Midnight matching her step for step at her side.